Okay, so today we will proceed to Zhuangzi, which is the final of our part one topics. So the reflective journals will be due on Monday by 11:59 p.m. if you choose to write a part one RJ. The Zhuangzi text is going to present certain difficulties that the other texts we've looked at so far haven't really presented us. And this largely has to do with the fact that there's really no consensus as how best to understand this book. And that doesn't just mean among modern scholars. There's 2,000-year-long commentarial tradition where there's not a lot of agreement as to what the text even means. And at first glance, that might make it seem like a very unpromising book to study. But there are actually reasons for this, and it might actually wind up being a feature of the text rather than a bug that it manages to defy interpretation. Since we don't have much time to address these texts in this course, I'm just going to suggest a few approaches as to how best to even try to make sense with and read the Zhuangzi. And the first suggestion I want to make is one of the ways in which the text was approached traditionally. Zhuangzi just means Master Zhuang. His actual name was said to be Guangzhou. He's traditionally believed to have existed, and it was initially believed to have written the whole book that has come down to us. So over time, people have identified more and more chapters as being apocryphal. The last traditional view is that the first 7 chapters are the key texts written by the historical Zhuangzi, though some modern scholars instead say we should view him as a semi-historical or even legendary figure who didn't exist at all. But these are matters of controversy that need not concern us, right? We just want to read the book and try to make some sense of it and relate it to the guiding themes of this course. And one strategy is to ask who this person Zhuangzi is in the Zhuangzi text and in surrounding commentaries. And it turns out there are about basically 4 predominant views as to who this guy even was. As for the Zhuangzi text, it's traditionally said to be from circa, that is roughly the 4th to the 3rd century BCE. So it's dated around the time of the other texts we've addressed. And it's a compilation of primarily allegorical tales. This is a translation of Yuyan as it occurs in chapter 27 of the Zhuangzi. In modern Chinese, it has a narrower meaning. It just means fables, but it used to have a broader meaning. And why is this important? Well, the tales aren't going to always mean what they literally say, right? So this makes matters even more complicated. So it's no wonder there's controversy as to how best to understand this text. So again, the interpretations of these stories and the text as a whole have been a matter of lively debate among Chinese intellectuals for over 2,000 years. Often, leading traditional authorities proffer conflicting interpretations of key ideas and passages. And sometimes these interpretations, even of a single concept, can run entirely contrary to one another. For instance, there's a concept in chapter 2 known as the Chengqin, which means something like a biased or prejudiced mindset on some readings, but on other readings, it's actually a positive attribute. Anyway, there's even disagreement as to what the proper genre of this work is. Some think it's primarily a philosophical work. Others take it primarily as a religious work, and yet others primarily as a literary work. The work, according to the critical historical perspective of contemporary scholars, was likely compiled out of independently circulating stories that latter-day compilers felt related to a figure named Guangzhou, also known as, again, Zhuangzi, Master Zhuang. As for this figure, Master Zhuang, one common strategy, again, is say how one reads the Zhuangzi, or how one understands the Zhuangzi text, is shaped by one's conception of this figure, Guangzhou. He's often presented traditionally, but not always, as a representative of a school known as Taoism. We mentioned Daojia in our lecture on Confucianism. And he's even presented as a follower of Laozi, who's largely considered to be the legendary author of the Tao Te Ching. Anyway, there have been 4 prevalent stereotyped conceptions of the figure that have shaped 4 different directions of interpreting the work. I should say these stereotypes all have a grain of truth in them, but you go astray when you impose them on the text too heavy-handedly. Like if you take this to be the whole story about this figure, or you overstate these claims, you're probably going to have a distorted picture of the text. He was sometimes understood as a kind of ungovernable and unrestrained maverick, right? Someone who lives outside the bounds and does his own things. But if we overstate this claim, one of our leading textual scholars, Wang Shumin, warns us this is actually hard to square with certain other things that are said in the text, such as an occasional emphasis on vigilance and circumspection. At other times, Zhuangzi was presented as an egoist, advocating the Suiwu doctrine, this for oneself doctrine, who was concerned with self-preservation. This is the view that people like Juxi and Song Dynasty took of this figure. But this is hard to square with certain doctrines in the book. You're going to see it says things like forgetting the self, not being preoccupied with oneself, not taking oneself too seriously, which are actually kind of hard to square with this particular doctrine. So this shouldn't be taken too seriously yet again. Another conception is that of Zhuangzi as a recluse, that is someone who withdraws from society and kind of does his own thing on the margins. But Wang Shunin again replies. He says this is hard to square with the stance of moving through the human world while not being shaken by it. And there are a number of images throughout the text that reflect this stance, such as walking without touching the ground or flying without wings. These are the idea that you can navigate society and interact with other people while maintaining some sort of inner unflappableness. Fourthly is the idea of Zhuangzi as an amusing and perhaps humorous, but ultimately vacuous chatterbox. That's to say, he's just kind of ranting and raving and not really saying anything all that meaningful. This is perhaps the most derogatory of these four stereotypes because it presents the text as not really telling us anything, right? At best, it's just amusing then. And Wang Xumin points out that this is, of course, hard to square with the coherent semantic content of the text. But if we subscribe to any one of these pictures, then go on to read the Zhuangzi, that will very much shape how we understand the text. And while I don't want to say these claims are completely false, there might be a grain of truth in all of them. We have to be careful not to overstate them. As for this general orientation of reading the Zhuangzi text in terms of the figure Zhuangzi, there's not even consensus about whether that's the best approach. For instance, one critic, Lin Yunming, whose edition of the Zhuangzi Yin, is mentioned in Dream of the Red Chamber, and was a somewhat influential edition, he says the Zhuangzi has been interpreted in different ways, with some using Laozi, that is the author of the Tao Te Ching, to interpret it, right? This is the view of viewing him as a part of the Taoist school. Some using Confucianism, including a number of famous poets and literati figures. They viewed Zhuangzi as a kind of closet Confucianists, and some used Chan or Zen Buddhism to understand the text. And Lin Yunming says, in the final analysis, they are forced and inappropriate. The thing to do is to interpret Zhuangzi on his own terms. So what we get here is a suggestion that there's no consensus of how people are reading it up through the Ming Dynasty or the late Ming Dynasty. Some of them read it in terms of different schools of thought. And he's suggesting that we understand Zhuangzi in terms of the figure Zhuangzi. And we just saw 4 different ways that can be fleshed out. Another commentator named Fang Yichi, also from the late Ming period, rejects this approach. He says those who interpret the Zhuangzi in terms of Zhuangzi are not the ones who understand Zhuangzi. What does that mean? Well, it can mean a number of things. But for Fang Yichi, he thinks the importance of the Zhuangzi text is that it has a certain effect on the reader, that it helps them find a certain kind of ease and helps them let go of their kind of purposive striving that is kind of the mark of ordinary human life. And he thinks the purpose of the Zhuangzi is to contemplate it, to find some ease, whereas people get preoccupied in textual exegesis or trying to understand Zhuangzi in terms of this figure Zhuangzi are kind of missing the mark of what the text is even about. But if we're not going to read it in terms of Zhuangzi, that raises the question of how we should, in fact, read text, right? It should be noted that we can ask this question in another way. We can ignore the predominant traditional conceptions, and we can just ask ourselves, how is this figure Zhuangzi presented in the Zhuangzi text itself? And he's a recurrent character in the text. You'll see in chapter 1, chapter 5, chapter 18, chapter 17, for instance, he's shown in philosophical conversation with his friend Huisher. There's also a famous butterfly dream story, and he displays a consistent indifference to public life and public honors. If we want to give a snappy account of Confucius, appealing to the figures of the early Zhou dynasty and trying to reinstate their beat or rituals to restore order, Zhuangzi would say humans go astray because we're preoccupied with ourselves. We think we're important. We want to be fancy and establish a name for ourselves. We want recognition and fame. We want to assert our own philosophical viewpoint at the expense of others. And all of these forms of self-assertion actually are going to breed contentiousness. And instead of being like that, he's indifferent to the various honors and achievements that people typically strive after in the mundane world. This will come up in a number of passages we'll discuss. These are all things you can look up, but we don't have time, unfortunately, to go through the stories closely. So if you want, you can turn back to the slides and find these individual stories in the text. One of our main accounts of this figure, Zhuangzi, comes from the records of the Grand Historian, which is the main philosophical source from the Han Dynasty. So a number of years after the fact. And we get a number of interesting things in this story. It mentions who some of the rulers were who were alive at the same time as Zhuangzi, which is very convenient. Why is that convenient? Well, it turns out in Chinese history, we have very good records of when different rulers reigned, right? We know when they held power. So if we know which rulers existed at the same time as Zhuangzi, we can approximately date when Zhuangzi lived. And it turns out he's a figure of the Warring States period, a contemporary of Mengzi. So a few generations after Confucius. The Grand Historian presents him as a critic of Confucians and Moists, we've mentioned. But the interesting thing is this anecdote that comes at the end of this. So he has a reputation for being a talented writer. And this is the Warring States period, so the competing states want talented writers to come to their states because then they're associated with this gifted artist, right? It gives their state cachet that the other states lack. And so they send up someone to recruit him to become a prime minister. And we already saw that he's not preoccupied with public life and public honors, so he turns down this fancy job. We can contrast Confucius, who was kind of a failure in his own lifetime, right? He was seeking to be a political advisor and couldn't find any work. Whereas Zhuangzi is basically having handed to him on a silver platter the type of job Confucius was desperately striving for. And here's what he says. Guangzhou smiled at the messenger who's offering him this fancy job and said, 1,000 gold represents a heavy profit, and the post of a prime minister is a distinguished position. But haven't you seen the sacrificial buffalo at the suburban sacrifices? They feed him well and dress him in patterned brocade, and then enter him into the great temple. And at that point, if he even wished to become even if he wished to become a piglet that has gone astray, there would be no way. What does this mean? It means the buffalo is going to be slaughtered, right? There were animal sacrifices, and they consecrate the bell with its blood. And he's saying, I don't want to be used as a fancy vessel because this is going to bring unnecessary danger to myself. So he's turning down the position, and he says, you buzz off, and don't you defile me with your offers. I prefer to take my pleasure in the gutters and please myself there. There's no way I'm going to be reined in by anyone running a state. To the end of my days, I shall refuse any public appointment and please myself that way. We can see that this story could be read as supporting a number of the stereotyped conceptions, but we won't dwell on that for too long. In chapter 17 of the Received Zhuangzi, a similar story as this occurs, where he turns down a public post. What's another conception? Well, we could actually, instead of trying to pin the Zhuangzi to a definite interpretation, we can view its suggestiveness as a feature rather than a bug. That is to say, we can view it as a challenging polysemous aesthetic work that stimulates and provokes the reader. Polysemous means it has multiple interpretations. Aesthetic work means it's something we contemplate, right? Maybe when we read works of literature, we discuss possible interpretations, and critics tell us strengths and weaknesses of it, but the idea that we found the definitive reading of a book is neither here nor there. And this is how a lot of literati commentators discussed it. We'll just look at a few of these quotes and then skip ahead. But Lin Xi, a very important commentator, said, while the book is a must-read, it's still a superlatively difficult read. Su Dongtuo, a very famous poet, spent an entire life with literature, and only from this did he come to comprehend Zhuangzi. Lu Deming, a famous Tang Dynasty philologist, says, by and large, the stories are all allegorical tales, and when one boils them down to underlying principles, one must not give priority to literalness. He's reaffirming what we already saw in chapter 27. We'll just look at one more of these quotes, then I'll jump ahead because I don't want to get too boggled down in this. Lin Yunming, who we saw before as advocating reading the Zhuangzi in terms of the Zhuangzi, says, when it comes to the Zhuangzi, one has to use the method of observing a cowrie shell when reading it. Whether this is the right translation, the idea is it's one of those iridescent shells where when you look at it, it assumes different colors under different lighting or based on the angle you look at it. And he says, look upon it squarely and it appears as though it were white. Look upon it sideways and it appears as though it were purple. Take a sidelong glance upon it and it appears as though it were green. And in the end, one finds it lacks a basic hue, a basic color. Nowhere can one take what one momentarily sees in it at face value, right? If we're looking for a work that's going to give us a definite philosophical position, and we take what this critic Lin Yunming is telling us seriously, we're in real trouble, right? Now you can see why there's difficulty in trying to introduce this text or even how to approach it in such a short lecture. Perhaps I'll quote one more figure. Wu Yingbin, the maternal grandfather of the fine Yizhi we looked at earlier, says, our friend Mr. Zhuang strikes a tone meant to create difficulties and perplexing doubts, leaving one to figure out where it is going for oneself. The idea is the text is challenging us. It's perplexing us. It's destabilizing our confidence in our own ways of understanding and navigating the world. It's presenting a challenge to us. And Fang Yizhi himself says, the Zhuangzi can be pondered or meditated upon, but it's not something that can be interpreted in the narrow sense. Ooh, that literally means subjected to methodical exegesis of the sort that scholars do. Anyway, another approach then is we can track recurrent themes through the text. So instead of asking who Zhuangzi was and reading the text in terms of that, based on what commentators have said, or instead of asking who Zhuangzi is in the Zhuangzi and reading the text in terms of that, we can look for recurrent ideas throughout the text and try to get a handle on that. Much in the way that one might try to get a handle on classical music, right? Especially Wagnerian music, where it has themes. It'll have recurrent themes. It'll develop the themes in different ways. It'll have dominant themes. And if we look for themes in the text, this might be a more fruitful approach for reading it, especially for purposes of introducing this text. And this is one way around these difficulties. And I only belabored the introduction because I want you to know that there's no consensus what this book means. It's just a real challenge to people. But if we look at recurrent themes, we might be able to get some idea of how to understand it. And I want to suggest the guiding theme, right? The guiding motif is this idea of yo, which means either roving or wandering, kind of like how a fish swims about, or untrammeled roving, xiao yao yo. And it's an easygoing and content state where one is not preoccupied with fancy titles, fame, such as public recognition, or indeed preoccupied with oneself. And these are, of course, characteristics of Zhuangzi on all four of the stereotyped conceptions. And I spell this out here as a potential guiding theme of the text. This leading motif or leading theme is seen as countervailing human tendencies towards self-regard, such as self-importance and self-righteousness, and the purposive frenzy that characterizes human life as it's ordinarily lived. Contrast this with the political life in the Nicomachean Ethics we saw, right? Zhuangzi is telling us that human life as it's ordinarily lived is somehow mistaken, right? We're just constantly trying to advance and move ahead. And he thinks that this can go too far. And we have tendencies to think our own views and our own reputations are more important than they in fact are. But there's an important qualification here. Some commentators caution that the work overstates its case to countervail these tendencies not to suggest utter frivolity. Why do I make this point? Well, some of the viewpoints expressed by different characters in the Zhuangzi text are quite extreme. Right? It could lead one into a kind of nihilism even. But the commentators warn us that the text is using exaggeration as a rhetorical strategy. Fang Yizhi, who we've looked at a few times, importantly warns that the text is sometimes used even to merely conceal one's own vulgarity and indolence. So what does Fang Yizhi mean here? Well, let's imagine that here's people in the default state. People are too serious. And then let's say here's where a lot of the characters in the Zhuangzi are, including Zhuangzi himself. Are basically insane, right? They're completely frivolous. They think human life is worthless, right? They're very extreme. We might say are too frivolous. And Zhuangzi is not trying to make us become utterly frivolous people, but he's trying to revert us to a mean, right? So the idea is we're here, he uses exaggeration to pull us here and then kind of stop here, right? So he's using exaggeration as a rhetorical strategy, according to these commentators. Not all commentators would agree with this. Some think he is actually advocating some of the extreme things we'll see the characters doing in the book. Whereas other commentators, such as Fang Yizhi, who I quote here, say this is the right way to look at this book. It's creatively overstating its case because it recognizes that people aren't going to come all the way here, but it will pull them away from being us, from where we are now, which is just taking ourselves too seriously, taking our humanity too seriously. He's trying to correct these kinds of tendencies on this sort of reading. And this seriousness manifests itself in various ways. He's against parochialism, which is narrowness of mind, right? Not being able to see things from other perspectives, and reified habits of thought. That's where we aren't flexible and lack the ability to change our mind or see things from different perspectives. One concept, which isn't always interpreted this way, but in many interpretations, is understood as an entrenched or reified mindset. That means your way of thinking is fixed, not flexible. And this is a mind that takes its own standards as fixed and correct. Another idea is this idea of a muddled mind, which literally means a mind that has weeds in it or is tangled with weeds. And this is a mind that can't see past its own parochial conceptions, its own narrow way of taking things. And the character of Hui Shi, who I mentioned earlier as often being in dialogue with Zhuangzi, he represents this type of person. He has a very narrow-minded notion of usefulness, for instance, which we'll discuss during our tutorials. He thinks he can't see potential uses or applications for things because he has a limited range of possible applications for those things. And this manifests in this theme of Yong or Yong, useless use. Another idea is that of the parochial scholar, one with an entrenched mindset and a muddled mind, such as Hui Shi, but also many Confucians, Mohists, and other sophists. This is how he's criticizing the philosophers. He's not engaging in philosophy per se, but he's engaging in a kind of meta-philosophy. He's looking at what philosophers are doing, and he sees them as holding on narrowly to their own particular doctrines and fighting and competing over them. This is illustrated with this dismissive quail in chapter 1, and famously with the frog in the well in chapter 17, which I mentioned, but we can't get into in the interest of time. Though perhaps if we have time at the end, I'll come back and go through some of the stories. So then, what he is in favor of, and in contrast to those figures who are beset by a kind of parochialism, is a broad-minded and openly receptive mindset. A capacious, that is broad-minded and expansive and flexible mindset is constitutive of untrammeled roving, right? Our guiding theme on this attempt to give a thematic account of the Zhuangzi as one way of approaching the text. without being just overwhelmed by it. This other theme, which we already mentioned, is 无用之用, the use of uselessness. The stories we're really going to cover in this course are going to generally be on this theme in the tutorial. And this should be thought of as an instance of moving beyond narrow conceptions of what's useful and what's useless. And these recur throughout the work. What is seen as useless by conventional standards can be recontextualized and reevaluated. A recurrent image in the text of the Zhuangzi is this idea of the useless tree. That is, it's a tree that carpenters don't want to cut down and use for anything because the wood's viewed as being worthless. You can't make anything out of it. And Zhuangzi points out, well, that's good for the tree then, because the tree doesn't, get murdered, right? It doesn't get chopped down. And he says that this uselessness of the tree then is useful for it because it helps it preserve its life. He gives many other instances as well, such as Wei Shi's massive board and massive trees at the end of chapter 1, which will be covered during the tutorials. He also does this in terms of people, not just trees. He presents some deformed and ugly people, but who, because of their very deformities, avoid all sorts of difficulties. One character in chapter 4, for instance, it's a severely hunchback person with some sort of disease. And again, this is written during the Warring States period, but because of his deformities, he doesn't get recruited into the military. And not being recruited into the military is a good thing when the whole empire's at war with itself, right? Because you don't have to get slaughtered. And he has all other sorts of advantages that stem from being ugly and diseased that conventionally minded people will overlook. My favorite story, perhaps in the inner chapters, it's a peculiar one in chapter 4, and this is one of the useless tree stories. There's a carpenter named Carpenter Stone. Notice the name, carpenters work with wood, not stones. A lot of the names in the texts are strange like this, but they're seldom translated in English. But if you're reading the Chinese version, do not recognize the names, right? There's something odd about the name Carpenter Stone. But anyway, what happens is he sees a tree, but he doesn't want to chop it down. And his apprentice asks him, why don't you want to chop it down? And he says, because its timber is useless. I can't do anything with it. And then the story takes a very surreal turn. The tree actually comes to him in a dream and starts talking to him and lecturing him about the use of uselessness. Right, so it's a rather intense kind of story with very interesting narrative elements for ancient texts. As for the nature of the world itself and why he's advocating this type of mindset and kind of maybe suggesting not being so parochial and inflexible, is because he views reality as shot through with changes and transformations. We'll recall for Plato, he thought the really real is unchanging, whereas for Zhuangzi, it turns out this world that around us is constantly in flux is reality, and we need to adapt ourselves to it as effectively as we can. He's not postulating a world above and beyond the world of perception. Though some traditional readings might complicate that claim somewhat, but this is a useful exaggeration for purposes of finding your bearings in this difficult text. So the nature of the world is characterized by constant flux. In the famous butterfly dream story at the end of chapter 2, for instance, we might think that this is a story about the nature of dreams and whether we're dreaming or waking at this moment. But the story concludes by saying, 此之谓五化, right? And this is quite interesting. It concludes by saying this is called the transformation of things. So it's actually a story about transformation. So it's not just material things transforming, but it's our perspectives transforming from waking and dreaming to changing our minds. Maybe we have a transformative experience which completely shifts our values that we used to hold. And these things happen throughout the course of a life. And death itself is presented as an instance of the overall process of transformation. This comes out famously in 2 back-to-back stories in chapter 6 with groups of friends who have a friend drop dead and they just act like lunatics, and kind of notoriously in chapter 18 with Zhuangzi's response to the death of his wife. So anyway, the fluidity of our prioritized assessment of situations is also subject to change and transformation. And we get a very politically incorrect story in chapter 2, where a woman is actually abducted and subjected to human trafficking, which is, of course, one of the most horrible things that presumably happened to a person. But then it turns out she's actually happy after the fact because she's treated really well and has a much better life than she had before. So some of the stories are a bit problematic, right, by today's standards, but it illustrates the point. Another one is the very opening story, which seems, according to some commentators, to set the theme of transformation, where a giant fish transforms into a giant bird. It's interesting to note that traditional commentators tell us that the name Kun is actually a name for a roe. And a roe is like the type of fish eggs or fish ovaries you get on Japanese food, right? A tiny speck. So why is he naming the absolute giant fish after a tiny speck? And he's playing with perspective here already. And Peng, according to many commentators, is an archaic version of the character for Phoenix, which is the most long-lived of the birds, are believed to be traditionally. And he's already playing on the theme of being long-lived, and these come up later in the story and throughout the text, right? So it's setting themes. So we have to be sensitive to these things when reading this sort of literary work. Otherwise, we're going to be too heavy-handed and miss the beauty of it, right? We don't want to just turn it into banal advice about being open-minded, flexible, right? We want to appreciate that this is a brilliant work of literature. Another way to make these same points, so again, we're being told we need to be flexible and open-minded, to put it crudely, and we're being told the world is shot through with changes and transformations. So Zhuangzi advocates theme, which in ancient Chinese can mean adapting to or taking as a criterion, like yunren in modern Chinese, or flowing along with the changes and transformations. So our carefree wanderer or untrammeled rover adapts to and is conditioned by the world in flux and refrains from imposing a fixed perspective on things. This comes up famously in the second chapter, with this famous 3 in the morning, 4 in the evening passage, where a monkey keeper manages to placate his flock of monkeys by adopting to their preferences. And this also comes up very curiously in chapter 3, in the famous story about Hao Ding, which is usually rendered as Butcher Ding, who's carving an ox's body. And this is an interesting metaphor for how to go about living your life on Zhuangzi's schemata, right? Right, there's a bone structure. Imagine I'm a buffalo for the moment. And if you're carving up its body, if you hit the bones, you're going to damage your knife, right? But if you just hit all of the open spots when you're carving me up into pieces, you're not going to damage your knife. And this is an image. There are many layers of imagery here, right? Ironically, it's in a chapter called On Nourished Life, which involves butchering, right, an animal. So there's already some weird imagery going on there. But the more interesting point is that you can adapt to the open aspects of a situation, or you can try to force your way and your preferences through it. And the knife that remains sharp is the one that follows the contours in the buffalo's body. Whereas the butcher who hacks and tries to have its way with the buffalo's body when butchering it is going to dull his blade. This is a very strange and interesting way to teach someone how to nourish life through the image of butchering an ox, right, or a buffalo, depending on how we decide to translate. Anyway, such adaptability is the mode of engaging the world of one who has a broad-minded and openly receptive mindset, right? You're just looking for a path of least resistance. A situation presents itself, and there are different ways you can go about handling it, and you try to be flexible enough to find an easier course through it. You try to find the various openings in the body or interstices and rest there, instead of trying to force your way through the bones to get these difficult courses. Contrast this with Confucius then. We saw early on in the Analects that Confucius thinks you need to be involved in politics even when it's futile. And we saw already that Zhuangzi in chapter 17 and in the records of the Grand Historian refused political posts because he knew it was dangerous, right? So their responses to the situation are completely different. And this maybe gives us a philosophical grounding for why Zhuangzi is doing that. He's trying to rest in the openings in the ox's body, as it were, in the situations confronting him, rather than needlessly putting himself in danger. And this perhaps supports some of the readings we saw, right? The recluse reading or the preserving his life reading. And that's why warn you, there are grains of truth in these stereotyped conceptions. Problems come when we impose them too heavy-handedly on the text. So we can look at how Lin Yunming unpacks some of these concepts. And it's interesting to note that if you read the Anglophone, that is the English language Zhuangzi scholarship, the main readings are very similar to this. Strange, suspiciously so, in fact. But sometimes Chengxin is taken as a main concept. And this means someone who has a fully formed or fixed mindset, who's not willing to adapt. And then you have yin and yin shi, which means to adapt, and yin shi means to adaptive affirmation. And this comes up in various ways in the texts. In chapter 5, we get this nice expression. In zi ran, which means going along with the, well, ziran in modern Chinese means nature, but here it means like the so of itself, what's spontaneously presenting itself. Going by the course of nature, we could say. Right? And this comes up in chapter 5. We have this yin shi from chapter 2. That's on the board now. And this means adaptive affirmation. We're going by this. What does this mean? Well, in classical Chinese, shi means something different than it does in modern Chinese. It means something is right or true. It means it's correct or true. So what you're taking to be right is going to be determined by circumstances, right? So the person who's placating the monkeys is engaged in yin shi, and that's one of the passages in which we get a similar idea as this in chapter 2. And this is contrasted, in fact, with this is contrasted by Lin Yunming and some contemporary commentators with what could be called Wei Shi. So this is taking something as right according to circumstances, and this is asserting something as right based on what you think is true, right? So this is what the person with the fixed mindset, the Chengxin, is going to do. And the flexible person who's going along with nature is going to engage in this mode of affirmation. You're not bringing in your own fixed perspective. Anyway, that's enough of me rambling about it. Here's how Lin Yunming himself describes it. And notice that his book is called Zhuangzi Yin, with the same yin in the title. And he actually explains that because he thinks this is the central idea of the book. So I'm at this point following his interpretation. Because it's a neat interpretation that you can use to follow many other interpretations, right? That's why I think it's a good one. It's maximizing the amount of readings you can take seriously. So he defines yin shi as the main subject of chapter 2, and he says the entire chapter articulates this idea. And he defines it as adapting to each of them, each other people asserting themselves as right, and not bringing into it a perspective of one's own. Right? So the way disputation typically goes is people passionately disagree with one another. Whereas Zhuangzi's strategy is just to not bother with that whole game. The Chengxin is what one's mind has arrived at, so one holds fixed opinions in one's breast. And then here he explains the title of his book. He says, he, meaning Zhuangzi, or Lin Yunming himself here, drifted about like an unmoored boat, emptily and idly roving along. When they said Zhuangzi is a magisterial servant, or Zhuangzi is a wicked man, or when they shouted out A, the variable A, and he considered himself an A, or when they shouted out B, he considered himself a B. Why would he, or I, here is the literal translation, have been concerned with whether they liked him or not? He was indeed only adapting to them, hence I take yin as the title of my book. And here's another version, Qi-Gu-Ran. Right, we already have yin zi-ran on the board. Qi-Gu-Ran actually comes from the story of carving the buffalo. This is how he describes Pao Ding carving the buffalo. He says he's going by what's solidly so in the buffalo's structure, right? This means that this is the knife looking for the opening, or it's you looking for the openings in situations. so as not to force your way through in an inefficacious way. Another doctrine, and this is the title doctrine of the second chapter of the received text, is Qi-U, which can mean something like leveling all things, putting all things on a par, or making all things equal. He thinks there's a sense in which all things are equal. So our untrammeled rover then, to cash this out in terms of our guiding theme, to continue fleshing out this thematic analysis of the Zhuangzi, comes to see all modes of being and all theories of things as, in a certain sense, on a par with one another. That sounds crazy, right? Is the flat Earth theory as good as the round Earth theory, right? What is he saying here? Well, the sense in which he thinks all theories and things are equal is that they are all more or less efficacious modes of adapting to and understanding the world. Some of them might be false, some of them might be true, some of them we might have no way of knowing whether they're true or false, but nonetheless, they're all views people have, and they're all ways people go about navigating with the world. And that's the thing we all have in common, irrespective of our other differences when it comes to the content of our beliefs or the different styles for orienting ourselves in this world. Thus, Zhuangzi could properly be said to be engaged in metaphilosophy. He's reflecting on the philosophical activities of his time, and Zhuangzi sees it as a power struggle of imposing one's own perspective over that of another, and is skeptical that we possess any non-question begging standards for ultimately sorting matters out with any high degree of certainty. There's a lot there, but the important phrase is non-question begging. There are a number of skeptical passages in the Zhuangzi where he says that if we're going to prove anything we say is true, we have to appeal to something to show it's true. And then someone will ask, well, why is that criterion you're appealing to? How do you know that criterion is true? Then you either have to appeal to a further criterion, right? And then someone will ask, well, how do you know if that criterion is true? And then you might have to appeal to a further criterion. And what's going to happen is you're either going to have an infinite regress, or you're going to have to eventually assert something dogmatically. You're just going to have to take something to be the case. And he thinks these skeptical arguments, I say he, because I'm simplifying matters, but it suggests that we really can't establish what the best orientation is in any sort of way that isn't assuming what it needs to prove, either by assuming that criterion or instead leading to an infinite regression. If that's difficult to follow, this dialogue occurs in chapter 2, so you can look it up there. But the important thing is, in a certain sense, all the philosophers are doing the same thing. They're suggesting what the best way of life is, and they're trying to assert it at the expense of others, right? Confucius is saying it's returning to the unique. Moza is saying it's universal love. Aristotle's saying it's the life of contemplation. Right? Plato's saying the highest form of human life is apprehending the form of the beautiful through, with that faculty through which we can do so. Right? These are all different philosophical suggestions. Zhuangzi is not so sure we can know any of them are right, but he is sure that people fight over who is right. Look at, say, partisan politics in the United States or elsewhere, right? And that can illustrate in a very very direct way what Zhuangzi is getting at here in a more sophisticated way. Another thing to note about Zhuangzi is he doesn't just think that humans are too serious as we ordinarily live our lives, but he actually thinks human life is kind of tragic. He thinks what we're doing as people, me, you, all of us, unless we're Zhuangzians, is tragic. He thinks there's something really sad about human life. He thinks the self-regard and purposive frenzy characteristic of human life actually prevents people from finding the joy of untrammeled roving. We're always preoccupied on the next thing we're striving for. We're always striving after things. And also the parochialism characteristic of humankind blinds them, meaning us, right? He's accusing us as people of, in some ways, harming ourselves. It can even prevent us from seeing certain dangers or from recognizing other perspectives. And here are a few instances in chapter 4 that you can look at. But we get really tragic imagery in particular in the second chapter of the text. He says, humans wear themselves down, pursuing uncertain and often futile ends. And we get this very kind of bleak picture of humanity from the second chapter. He says, we proceed as though in a gallop, like we're moving forward fast like horses or a colt. and nothing whatsoever can bring us to a halt. Is this not tragic? Now, bei usually means just sad or psychological despondency, but it takes on more weight in the Zhuangzi. It means that our condition is actually in some way tragic. We're wearing ourselves down, pursuing ends. And it's not really clear where those ends lead. And it's not just like trying to pursue fancy titles or achievements, but it's even the pursuit of knowledge and all other things, all other insatiable lines of desire that Zhuangzi sees as tragic fetters that most humans are bound by. And here we get some of the nihilistic perspective. And this is where I remind you of what I said earlier, right? Where he sometimes uses exaggeration. We always need to ask ourselves if Zhuangzi is exaggerating as a rhetorical strategy. In the 6th chapter, we get these various groups of friends who tell us that human life is just a pimple and death is its bursting, right? This kind of grotesque image of what human life is. But in a sense, maybe that's true, right? Energy comes together. I was born, I live for a few years, and then I drop dead. And maybe in the interim, I frantically pursue things and I don't actually get to achieve anything like untrammeled roving. This is a very nihilistic picture of human life. So we might ask ourselves if he thinks we're kind of trapped here and he's exaggerating to pull us here rather than all the way here. I'm not advocating the nihilism of some of these passages. Another kind of grotesque image is they present human life as food entering the mouth, right? You're born, it moves through your digestive tract, and then you die when it's pooped out, right? Another kind of grotesque, but slightly humorous image. Human life, the human mind, and human perspectives are seen as part and parcel of broader processes of cosmic change, right? These changes and transformation that are characteristic of the world around us, as we've already said. I'll just make a few brief remarks on receptions and responses to the Zhuangzi before we call it a day. One interesting thing to note about the Zhuangzi is there's a tendency of it to become fashionable during periods of dynastic downturn. So Chinese history is you have a flourishing dynasty, and then eventually it falters, a new dynasty is established, eventually it falters, and so on and so forth, right? And that's the whole history. And Zhuangzi, literati tended to read it and write the best commentaries on it during periods of societal decline. When the Song dynasty collapsed, when the Ming dynasty collapsed. And Qianmu, a famous historian, one of the founders of CUHK, said the Zhuangzi is a text for an age of decline. And this isn't just because it was written during the Warring States period, but it's because people read this text and found solace in this text during periods of societal downturn. And he mentions a number of commentators, including some we've looked at in this course, who turned to the text. And then Qianmu wrote his own Zhuangzi commentary during the Chinese Civil War of the last century. And he says, my own life is confronting an age once more in decline. As the age becomes increasingly tumultuous, what I personally grasp in Zhuangzi's finer points is increasingly profound. There's also a bit of an adage, a Confucian when successful and a Taoist when a failure, right? It gives someone resources for finding meaning in life when your life's just gone to hell, right? You have to understand these literati commentators were people at the top of society. They had stable jobs, wealth, and then they lost it all. Wang Fuji, for instance, had to live in the mountains during the late Ming to hide from the conquering Manchurians. So did Feng Yizhi, who ultimately had to kill himself because the persecution against him was so severe, right? These are people who had very difficult lives, and they wrote commentaries on Zhuangzi to help make them feel better about their circumstances. So this is a powerful text that has helped people despite all of its suggestiveness. So here are just a few concluding remarks, because again, this is a very difficult text for me to teach you in such a short period of time because there isn't a standard reading of it. But now that we see something of the message or apparent message of the text, we can understand why it's not asserting one definite position, right? Because its very viewpoint is not to bring a standard fixed position in situations. So if it turns its position into a fixed position, it's contradicting itself, right? On grounds of self-referentiality. If he says that I'm suggesting the perspective of no perspective, in fact, he at one point says, Bu Dao Zhi Dao, a Dao that is not a Dao. This Dao doesn't have any specific content. It's just about being open and receptive. So it kind of makes sense that it would be hard to find a consistent underlying philosophy in this text. Anyway, if reading the Zhuangzi helps one find ease and moves one past the purposive frenzy and self-regard characteristic of our often petty and vain species, right? We're often here, too serious. Even if only for a moment, then that is a net gain for us and our human ilk. In any event, that is a culturally all-important function that the work served for many literati commentators, particularly those confronting a downtrodden age, a period of societal collapse. Rather than teasing out a systematic philosophy, like we did with the other philosophers we covered in this course, the work is sometimes more fruitfully read as provoking one's imagination, exploding habitual patterns of thought, and ultimately leading towards an overall attitudinal shift towards what it is to be alive. The work also served as an inspiration for many artists working in various mediums. That is to say, this book also influenced people outside of literary circles or philosophical circles, painters, and all sorts of artists were deeply inspired by the work. And it also played a vital role in the synesthesis of Buddhism. When Buddhism comes into China, as we'll see in our next lecture, the Zhuangzi provided a lot of vocabulary used for understanding it. Anyway, that's a lot to cover, and it's a rather difficult text to present, but I thank you for your attention, and with that, you are free to go. So thank you. Bye-bye.